vehicle on.
Copy that, ELCOM. All systems are go for entry, descent, and landing. Stand by. Stand by.
At the dawn of the 21st century, space agencies in Europe and America began making plans to land the first humans on Mars. But manned missions to the Red Planet have been proposed before. For some, Mars holds the answers to mankind's future in space. Others say Mars is too far, too dangerous, and too expensive for humans to explore. And in a world torn by troubles, some say there is no need, or will, for mankind to reach into space anymore. More than 30 years after the last Apollo astronaut walked on the moon, the American manned space program seems to have lost its way, unable to reach beyond even low Earth orbit.
We've got a problem. NASA has been literally going around in circles with its space program for the past 30 years.
Astronautical engineer Dr. Robert Zubrin has been arguing for years that sending humans to Mars is the mission the space program needs.
It's time that we set goals for NASA that were worthy of the risks of human spaceflight. Mars is the next logical step in our space program. It's the challenge that's been staring us in the face for the past 30 years. It's the planet that's most likely Earth. It's the planet that has on it the resources needed to support life and therefore someday technological civilization. It's the planet that will provide us with the answer as to whether life is prevalent in the universe or exclusive to the Earth. And it's the planet that will give us the critical test as to whether humanity can break out of the planet of our birth and become a spacefaring species.
In the early 1990s, Zubrin was the head of the Mars Direct program at Martin Marietta Astronautics. His team developed a mission to Mars that could be done at a fraction of NASA's projected costs. Using only existing technology, Zubrin argues that the first steps on Martian soil could be made within 10 years.
There is absolutely nothing in this that is beyond our technology.
We are not ready to send humans to Mars right now. We don't know how to keep them alive. There are people out there who say we can go to Mars tomorrow. One of my requirements, one of NASA's requirements, is that if we send humans to Mars, we bring them back alive.
For the past 15 years, Zubrin and his colleagues have waged a campaign to convince society and the political class that humans on Mars should be the goal for NASA now. This is the story of our cold neighboring planet and the debate over whether man's fate is tied to the red world. It's the story of an engineer's journey and the battle of ideas over which direction in space will truly benefit mankind.
We're at a crossroads today. We either muster the courage to go or we risk the possibility of stagnation and decay.
The victor in this debate could determine the fate of mankind. Will we become a spacefaring species? Will we live on more than one planet?
In the winter of 2003, the Chinese put their first taikonaut in space. The Chinese Space Administration plans to begin a manned program of moon exploration by 2017. The European Space Agency has outlined a plan for humans to the moon by 2024 and to Mars by 2033. And the Russians, building on years of experience, are conducting tests for long-duration Mars missions. In America, with the impending retirement of the shuttle fleet and the completion of the International Space Station, the Bush administration announced in 2004 the Constellation program,
on the moon,
a plan that would return Americans to the moon by 2020. But the program was never fully funded and was eventually cancelled. In 2010, the Obama administration announced its vision for NASA and human Mars exploration.
By the mid-2030s, I believe we can send humans to orbit Mars and return them safely to Earth. And a landing on Mars will follow. And I expect to be around to see it.
With a new timeline for humans to Mars sometime after 2035, and with administrations changing every 4 or 8 years, it is far from certain that such a plan will be realized. 20 years earlier, the first President Bush also proposed a long-term human exploration program, under great fanfare. The program quietly died in Congress a few years later.
If you want to go to Mars, you cannot do it in 30 years. You can't do it in 20 years. You've got to do it in 10 years or less from program start, or you're more or less guaranteeing political failure.
To date, only the Apollo moon program, which was announced in 1961 and had men on the moon 8 years later, has succeeded in getting astronauts beyond low Earth orbit.
I was 5 when Sputnik flew. And while to the adults, Sputnik was a terrifying event, to me, as a child who was already reading science fiction, it was exhilarating, because it meant that this possibility of a spacefaring future was going to be real. And I was 9 when Kennedy gave his speech committing us to the moon.
To go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I grew up during the 60s, when it was Mercury, it was Gemini, it was Apollo. Every month, NASA was doing something more impressive than in the month before. We were going to be on the moon by 1970, Mars by 1980, Saturn by 1990, Alpha Centauri by the year 2000. We were moving out, and I wanted to be part of that. And so I got myself a scientific education. But then, in the early 70s, it's all collapsed. We achieved the first part of that program, moon by 1970, but the Nixon administration shut down the rest, and we did not move out into space. And for a while, I accepted that, grudgingly. I became a science teacher. But then in the early 80s, something hit me, and I said, I'm not going to accept myself doing less than what I had dreamed of doing when I was a boy.
Zubrin went back to graduate school, getting advanced degrees in engineering and aerospace. He then went on to work at Martin Marietta, which later became Lockheed Martin, designing interplanetary missions. It was here that Zubrin's obsession with the red planet began to take hold. While at Martin in the 1990s, Zubrin and his colleagues developed a plan for sending humans to Mars that changed NASA's thinking on the issue. But the plan has languished on the drawing boards ever since. Now, as president of the Mars Society, Zubrin is at center stage in the debate over the future of manned spaceflight. Known as a smart, visionary scientist, he has authored several books on exploring space and is the self-appointed spokesman for the possibility of colonizing Mars.
Mars is where the future is. Mars is the closest planet to the Earth that has on it all the resources needed to support life and therefore technological civilization. It has water, it has carbon, it has nitrogen, it has a 24-hour day, it has a complex geological history that has created mineral ore, it has sources of geothermal energy. Mars is a place we can settle.
One reason for such optimism over a frozen world like Mars is evidence that 2 billion years ago, Mars was a much warmer and wetter place.
We think that at one time in the ancient past, Mars was very similar to the condition of early Earth.
This Martian warm age lasted for over 1 billion years and could have been a suitable environment for the development of life.
If we go to Mars and find evidence of a second genesis on Mars, I think we can conclude that the universe is full of life. We can probably conclude that on some planets that life evolves to more complex forms, and I think we'd be reasonable to conclude that intelligence could also emerge on some planets as well. It really does answer the question, are we alone? And that to me is a question that transcends science. It's a philosophical, societal, as well as scientific question. To me, that's the big prize. That's why Mars is interesting. That's why human exploration makes sense.
Space programs are often criticized for the huge sums of money they require. Although the American space program is less than 1% of the federal budget, a human mission to Mars may have to wait for better times.
There are those who say that we have many problems to deal with here on Earth, and we need to postpone ventures such as the human exploration on Mars until these problems are solved. Well, there were many problems in Spain in 1492, and there still are. There are problems that need to be dealt with here on Earth, and should be dealt with. But we also have to think of the future. We also have to think about opening up new volumes in human history. I believe that it's essential for a positive human future that humanity expand into space. The greatest value that we got out of Apollo was the creation of intellectual capital through the inspiring of millions to go into science and engineering to be part of the great adventure of human expansion into space.
There's a phrase that happened with the Apollo program, which was, if we can go to the moon, we can. And then everybody's filled in whatever they were interested in. Build mass transit, cure cancer, do this, do that. The point is, it did give us a sense that we could accomplish great things. It did bring out the best of us.
We excited a generation of engineers and scientists. The generation that built the computers and cell phones and all the technology everybody uses today and takes for granted.
If we set humans to Mars as our goal, we'll get millions of new scientists that will create new inventions, new industries. This is the enormous payback, and we can get it if we set the kind of challenge that will inspire the youth.
To Zubrin, civilizations like people thrive on challenge and decay without it.
We have everything we have today because of our predecessors who had the courage to leave the world of the known and go out into the wilderness and build new cities. And if we stop being people like that, then we will hand down much less to our posterity than our ancestors handed down to us. So there's the choice in life. One either grows or one decays. Grow or die. I think we should grow.
History proves that we have never lost by pressing the limits of our frontier.
In the summer of 1989, the first President Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative, directing NASA to draw up long-term plans to get humans back to the moon and begin developing a program of manned Mars exploration. At Martin Marietta, Zubrin and his colleagues looked forward to moving NASA's space program outwards after 2 decades in low Earth orbit.
Of course, we were very excited when Bush made his call saying that he was making a national commitment to implement such a program.
NASA assembled a large team to take on the space initiative. In 90 days, the team developed a 30-year plan that required an enormous buildup of space infrastructure.
What the NASA bureaucracy decided to do was basically design the most complex mission they possibly could in order to make sure that everyone's pet technology would remain mission critical, which is the exact opposite of the correct way to do engineering.
First, NASA would triple the size of the planned space station and add enormous hangars, as well as free-floating fuel depots, checkout docks, and cruise stations. Then, on the moon, they would construct more shipbuilding facilities, bases, and depots. Next, the moon crew would construct the Mars ship, a huge craft dubbed by its detractors as Battlestar Galactica. This ship would carry everything to Mars over an 18-month flight. Once in Mars orbit, a small group would descend to the surface, spend a few days, then plant a flag in the ground and go home. The plan became known as the 90-day report.
To those of us at Martin who had been engaged in designing Mars missions, when they saw the monstrosity of complexity of the 90-day report, we were dismayed, and it was readily apparent to anyone with any insight that that program would fail politically.
The plan was submitted to Congress. The estimated cost, $450 billion. The legislators went into sticker shock. This would have been the single most expensive program for the United States since World War II. By the end of 1990, Congress had refused all requests for SEI funding. When the realization came that SEI was doomed, Zubrin wrote a memo to his colleagues at Martin Marietta, outlining his problems with the NASA plan and arguing for a more direct approach. Zubrin favored launching a Mars mission directly from the surface of Earth, using only existing rocket technology. This negated the need for a lunar base and avoided the complexity and cost of building ships in space. He also objected to NASA's plan for a short surface stay on Mars, a mission that would amount to little more than a flag and footprints exercise. To Zubrin, we were going to Mars to explore and develop a new world. To maximize surface time, Zubrin proposed using a faster flight path, known as a conjunction-class mission. This would mean a crew could arrive on Mars after only a 6-month journey. They would then remain on the Martian surface for a 1.5 years. This would give the team time to explore a wide area and conduct detailed research about the planet. Then, as the Earth return window opens, the crew would launch from Mars for the 6-month trip home. Zubrin was convinced that a simplified, more robust and cost-effective mission could be designed using these principles. Along with several like-minded colleagues, Zubrin decided to ask management at Martin to allow them to design alternative Mars missions.
The management approved that, and we formed a team. It was known as the Scenario Development Team, of just 12 people from the whole very large Martin company.
One team member, whose thinking was closely aligned with Zubrin's, was David Baker.
I went off to my office and said, all right, how would I do a Mars mission if I had to pay for it and I had to go on the ride? And I said, well, it's going to be simple. There's going to be no on-orbit assembly. I really tried to take everything out of the mission that didn't absolutely need to be there.
While the rest of the team focused on longer-term, more traditional mission plans that required on-orbit assembly, Zubrin and Baker decided to collaborate on a mission that could be done near-term.
We decided to do Mars the way Lewis and Clark did America. Okay? Use the local resources, travel light, live off the land.
Zubrin and Baker were convinced that a Mars mission could be launched directly from the ground. The other team members felt this was impossible, that the weight of the rocket fuel required for a round trip to Mars was so enormous it would render the launch ship impossibly heavy. To solve this problem, Zubrin was exploring a radical idea that had been kicked around the aerospace industry since the 1970s. The idea was to produce a methane-oxygen rocket fuel directly from the Martian atmosphere. It was a relatively simple and robust chemical engineering procedure that was done commonly in the 1800s, the era of the gaslight. If the idea worked, astronauts could land a relatively light ship with empty tanks. They wouldn't have to ship all the fuel with them for their return trip. This would radically lower their size and weight. The only problem was methane-oxygen fuel requires a hydrogen component. Hydrogen exists on Mars in the form of H2O, but water may be difficult or impossible to extract from the Martian environment.
Really, the hydrogen was only 5% of the total weight of the methane-oxygen propellant being manufactured. So if you just say, okay, we won't be pure, we won't get all of the propellant from Mars, we'll just get 95% of the propellant from Mars. The other 5%, the hydrogen, we'll just bring from Earth.
Another fundamental resource that could be extracted from the Martian environment is oxygen. A second processing unit could separate oxygen molecules from the thin carbon dioxide atmosphere, providing breathable air for a Mars crew.
If used intelligently, the same resources that make Mars interesting are precisely what could make it attainable.
Baker and Zubrin had greatly reduced their mission mass, but they still found their ship was too heavy and would require 2 launches and assembly in space. Then Zubrin hit on an idea.
Well, one of the key events of the Mars Direct development was one morning Bob burst in my office and said, "I've got it."
The idea that I finally hit on in 1989 was that we would split the mission up into 2 parts, and we'd send the return vehicle out first with its own return propellant plant. So the propellant would be made on Mars before the first astronauts ever left Earth.
With 2 separate direct-to-Mars launches, a human crew would have a fully fueled ship waiting for them on the surface of Mars before they ever left Earth. So Zubrin and Baker had come up with a plan that seemed to accomplish all of their goals. It was relatively inexpensive, development time was short, they could use existing technology, and it allowed for a long stay on the Martian surface. They dubbed their idea Mars Direct.
SSC disconnect enable on. 35. Let guys go. Hydraulics go.
Aboard an Ares rocket is the Earth Return Vehicle, or ERV. No one is aboard this ship. It will pave the way for the astronauts who, years later, will use the ERV to return to Earth.
1. And liftoff.
On its second day, the ERV deploys a small nuclear power reactor. The reactor powers a chemical plant inside the ERV. The plant will produce the methane-oxygen rocket fuel for the launch home. Nearby, a second robotic rover is guided to a pre-picked landing site for the human crew. It places a radar transponder to help guide the astronauts in. The long journey to land a human being on Mars begins.
3, 2, 1, engine start.
Carrying the most skillfully assembled flight team in history, 4 astronauts begin their 2.5-year mission to the Red Planet. This will be the first time a human has gone beyond the Earth-Moon system, 250 million miles farther than any person has ever been. To counter the health problems of zero gravity and to fully acclimate the astronauts to Mars, the ship will deploy a weighted tether attached to the last stage of the spent rocket booster. By thrusting the ship into a rotational spin, the counterweight of the rocket will create centrifugal force and thus artificial gravity. The crew will be able to live with their feet planted firmly on the floor during their 6-month transit. But the HAB is not entirely alone on its journey. Just ahead of it is a second ERV, identical to the first. Launched just a few weeks prior to the HAB, it will prepare the way for a second human crew that will follow 2 years later. It can also function as a backup for the first mission, if anything should go wrong. On the 6th month of the flight, the crew will gaze upon an alien world. This is the new frontier.
Oh, spectacular. Just spectacular.
After days in orbit and satisfied with the landing conditions, the crew will receive final word from Mission Control on Earth.
All systems are go for entry, descent, and landing. 3, 2, 1.
It will be a tense 40 minutes before people back on Earth get the signal from Mars and know if everything has gone well.
Okay, 75 feet. Cars looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. Forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Big shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
We're seeing it on the LTP. We're on Mars, everybody.
For more than 500 days, the astronauts will live on Mars and embark on one of the greatest journeys of discovery in the history of science. Will they find life? Or the fossilized remains of past life? Such a discovery could tell us whether our solar system has seen more than one Genesis, and answer the ultimate question: are we alone? In any case, these explorers will be learning how feasible the colonization of Mars really is, and whether or not mankind has a future among the stars. Then, when the time comes and the window for Earth return opens, the crew will climb into their Earth return vehicle and head home. They will arrive home heroes, the first to stretch the limit of man's expanse from one planet to another, their names added to the list of great explorers of new worlds. In their footsteps, others will follow. What began as a trickle is free to rise into a deluge of humankind, sweeping over a once barren land and transforming it into a viable new world. When Baker and Zubrin presented Mars Direct to their bosses at Martin, they expected the worst. To their surprise, management was excited about it. They liked the fact that everything needed was relatively simple and near-term.
As time went on, Martin Marietta embraced Mars Direct as their creation and put Bob and I on an airplane to several NASA centers to present Mars Direct and try to build some momentum for it.
Baker and Zubrin flew to the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. This had been one of the original design hubs for the Apollo moon landings, but recently many of the engineers had become demoralized by the failure of NASA's SEI program. Tag team style, Baker and Zubrin presented their alternative mission architecture. The response was thrilling. The old-school Apollo crowd embraced it. This was a plan that actually made sense and was within reach.
Baker and I gave a number of briefings. The first was at the Marshall Space Flight Center. Next was at Johnson. These people were incredibly excited.
Over the next few weeks, Zubrin and Baker were flown around the country, pitching to all branches of NASA. And everywhere they went, the response was electric. The plan was standing up to scrutiny, and groups all over NASA were converting to Mars Direct. Their tour culminated in a public presentation to the National Space Society. The crowd gave the two aerospace engineers a standing ovation. A week later, the story was in newspapers around the country. But a counterattack was beginning to form within NASA. The space station teams and many in the advanced propulsion groups were against the idea. Since Mars Direct didn't need their programs, they felt under threat. As quickly as doors opened for Zubrin and Baker, they began to close.
NASA didn't want to pursue a Mars mission at that time. They didn't want to be derailed by a bunch of Mars fanatics that thought that their idea of what NASA should do should overwhelm what NASA thought NASA should do.
What we did in Mars Direct was literally come up with the leanest solution, the one that involved the least spending on an assortment of technologies and infrastructural elements, including, for example, we made no use whatsoever of the International Space Station. And so people involved in all those programs were very upset because we were showing that you could go to Mars without their program being required. And they felt that we were de-justifying them.
The NASA administration rejected Mars Direct. The two engineers were outsiders again. But Zubrin remained determined.
Bob had grabbed hold of it, and I could see that it was his, and no matter what I did, he was going to do what he was going to do. And he was going to be a proponent for it and push it, and I really saw my role sort of evaporate. It's a little bit like being a dim planet next to a bright star around him in terms of his enthusiasm, and you really can't compete with that. All you can do is decide how you're going to deal with it.
By February 1991, Baker quit Martin to start his own firm. Zubrin battled on. For the next year and a half, Zubrin tried to get NASA to pay attention, giving speeches, writing papers, but Mars Direct's time seemed to have passed. But then in 1992, a new administration came into power at NASA, and Zubrin saw a second chance.
I was invited to brief Mike Griffin, who was the Associate Administrator for Space Exploration in charge of the whole Space Exploration Initiative. He immediately became a very strong supporter of Mars Direct.
But before the engineers at NASA would take another look at Mars Direct, they wanted Zubrin to prove that producing rocket fuel on Mars could work. They gave Martin Marietta a small budget to do an experiment. Zubrin and his team built a machine called the In Situ Propellant Plant. It could take carbon dioxide, the dominant gas in the Martian atmosphere, combine it with a little hydrogen, and produce a methane-oxygen fuel.
We did it in 3 months with a very small team. We built a plant that was 94% efficient, and no one who actually participated in that effort was actually a real chemical engineer. They were all aerospace engineers, like me, who were simply dabbling in chemistry in order to prove to NASA that 19th century chemical engineering really worked.
With the experiment a success, the administration had Zubrin give detailed briefings of the mission plan to the engineers at the Johnson Space Center. They liked it, but had some problems. Dave Weaver was the lead mission architect.
There were a number of things that we were concerned about with Bob Zubrin's mission. First of all, we thought his estimates of mass were probably too optimistic. Didn't have sufficient margins for a variety of things, not the least of which would be things like provisions for the crew, the amount of water that would be required. We thought his ascent vehicle was very large, which meant his power requirements, his propellant requirements were much larger than needed to be. His trip times out were too long, and that for very little effort you could get them shorter. The other problem was the size of his crew. He had a 4-person crew. I think virtually every study that's been done says that a 4-person crew for a 3-year type of mission is probably not realistic.
Weaver took Zubrin into his office, and the two men worked out compromise mission architecture. First, Weaver wanted 3 launches for every mission instead of 2. The first year, 3 ships would launch: a MAV, Mars Ascent Vehicle, an unoccupied HAB, and an ERV, Earth Return Vehicle. The HAB and MAV would land on the surface and begin producing fuel for the return flight and air for the crew. These craft would